Welcome to English with Zenko Master. Get ready to learn something new today.
It was a cold winter morning in our small coastal town. The wind from the sea was strong, and I pulled my scarf tight around my neck as I walked along the narrow street. The houses stood close together, their windows wet with sea mist. I had not eaten breakfast, and my stomach felt empty. My boots made a dull sound on the cobblestones as I walked past the market square. Then I heard it. The sound came from the corner of the street, from a shop with dusty windows and a faded blue door. It was the music shop, the only one in the town. Old Mr. Clancy owned it. People said he could play the violin better than anyone in the county, but no one said he was kind. He rarely spoke to people unless they were paying customers. His shop was filled with violins, tin whistles, and old accordions. The smell of polished wood and old paper filled the air around it. That morning, I had no plan to go inside. I had no coins in my pockets, only the hope of finding something to warm me on the way to my aunt's house. But the music stopped me where I stood. A violin was playing a tune I had known since I was a child. My mother used to hum it while she worked in the kitchen. The notes were warm and gentle, even though the wind was cold on my face. Without thinking, I closed my eyes for a moment and listened. The melody floated out through the old shop door and into the street. It wrapped around me like a blanket, soft and light. I forgot the cold for a moment. I forgot my empty stomach. I only felt the music moving through me, like a memory I had been missing. I stood there, not moving, afraid that if I stepped away, the sound would vanish. Then I felt someone watching me. I opened my eyes and saw Mr. Clancy standing in the shop doorway. His scarf moved in the wind, and his eyes were fixed on me. His face was tight, as if the music had not brought him joy at all. Before I could say anything, he stepped forward, took hold of my sleeve, and told me to come with him. I was too surprised to pull away. His grip was strong, and the wind seemed to push us along the street. We crossed the square, passing the stalls where traders were setting out bread, fish, and vegetables. A few people looked at us, but no one spoke. I felt my cheeks grow hot, though the air was cold. I had no idea what I had done to make him so angry. We stopped at the village hall. It was a low building with a heavy wooden door. Mr. Clancy pushed it open, and we stepped into the warm, dim room. The smell of peat smoke from the fire filled the air. At a table near the hearth sat Mrs. O'Dwyer, the village elder. She was an older woman with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She looked up from her papers with surprise. It was still early in the morning, and the bells from the church had only just finished ringing 8. She set down her pen and asked what was going on. Mr. Clancy wasted no time. He began telling her that I had been standing outside his shop, taking in the sound of his music without paying for it. He said his music was his work and his property, and that it was unfair for me to enjoy it without giving anything in return. Mrs. O'Dwyer listened without a word. Her eyes did not leave his face. She did not look at me until he had finished. Then she turned and asked me to explain. I told her I had taken nothing from the shop. I had only been standing on the street. I said the music had come out into the air on its own. I could not stop it from reaching my ears. I had no coins and no way to pay. I had not even touched the shop door. The room was quiet for a moment after I spoke. Outside, the wind made the sign above the hall creak on its chains. I could hear the faint cry of gulls over the harbor. "Mrs." O'Dwyer's face was calm, but I could not guess what she was thinking. She asked me to empty my pockets. I placed the few things I had on the table: a folded piece of paper, 2 buttons, and a small shell I had found on the beach the day before. There was no money. She nodded slowly and then looked at Mr. Clancy. She told him it was true that music was the work of his hands and his skill. She also said it was true that I had enjoyed that music without paying for it. Therefore, she said, I must pay him. My stomach dropped. I felt my fingers curl into fists inside my sleeves. I had no idea how I could do what she was asking. Mr. Clancy's mouth curved upward, perhaps imagining the coins he thought he would soon hold. But then Mrs. O'Dwyer told me to clap my hands. I stared at her for a moment, then slowly brought my hands together. The sound of the clap echoed in the hall. She told me to do it again, and then once more. The sound was sharp and clear, filling the room just as the music had filled the street. When I stopped, she turned to Mr. Clancy and said that the sound of applause was the proper payment for music that had been enjoyed without cost. She said he had been paid in full. For a moment, he looked as if he could not believe what he had heard. Then his face closed again, the smile gone, and he turned and walked out of the hall without a word. I stood still for a moment, not sure if I should laugh or apologize. Mrs. O'Dwyer only told me to be on my way and to remember that some of life's gifts are given freely, whether we expect them or not. I stepped back into the cold morning, the sound of my clapping still warm in my hands. I walked slowly across the square, the market stalls brightening with color as more people arrived. The wind was still strong, but for the first time that day, I did not mind it. I kept hearing the music in my head, not as it had come from the shop, but as it now lived in my memory. And I thought about what the elder had said, wondering how many things in life could never be bought or sold. No matter how hard someone tried. The wind carried me home that morning, but my thoughts stayed in the village hall. The sound of the violin still lived somewhere inside me, mixed with the echo of my own clapping. I could still see the look on Mr. Clancy's face when the elder had told him he had been paid. His eyes had been dark, not with the satisfaction of someone who had won, but with the sharpness of someone who believed they had been cheated. I wondered if I would see him again soon, and if he would remember me the way I now remembered him. The road to my aunt's house was lined with old stone walls. On one side, the field sloped down to the sea, where the waves were gray and restless. On the other, small cottages stood with smoke curling from their chimneys. My aunt's house was the last in the row. She was not home that morning, but she had left the key under the mat. The fire in the hearth was low, but I stirred it back to life with a few pieces of turf. Soon the room was warm, and I sat down near the window thinking about what had happened. I had grown up hearing music in this town. On summer evenings, people would sit outside the pub with fiddles and flutes, playing until the sky turned purple. At weddings, the air was full of quick tunes that made people dance, even those who had said they were too tired. My father had played the whistle when I was small, and my mother's voice could fill a room without effort. Music was part of everything here, and it had never been something I thought could be owned like a loaf of bread or a bag of flour. But Mr. Clancy saw it differently. I had heard people talk about him in the market. They said he had once played in grand theaters far from here, but something had happened that made him return. Some said it was an injury to his hand. Others said it was his temper. No one knew for sure. All I knew was that he kept to himself, and the music from his shop was rare, like sunlight on a winter day. That morning, I had not meant to take anything from him. Yet I had taken something in a way, and perhaps that was why his anger had burned so bright. The days after that morning were busy with work. My aunt needed help with the chickens and the small vegetable garden. I carried baskets to the market, sold eggs, and came home with flour or sugar. I walked through the same square where Mr. Clancy's shop stood, but I did not see him. The blue door stayed closed, and the windows showed nothing but shadows. I began to think he was avoiding the street when I was near, though perhaps it was my own mind inventing that idea. One afternoon, as I returned from the harbor, I heard music again. It came faintly from the direction of the shop, but this time it was not a violin. It was a tin whistle, high and clear, playing a slow, careful tune. I stopped at the far corner, too far to see the door, and listened. There was a mistake in the playing. Then the sound stopped, then began again. It was as if someone was practicing rather than performing. I stood for a while, letting the sound reach me without moving closer. When it ended, I walked home without looking at the shop. That night I could not sleep. The sound of the whistle was in my head, mixed with the memory of the violin. I thought about my father's whistle, which had been kept in a drawer since he passed away. I had not played it in years, but now I felt the urge to find it. I rose quietly and searched the old chest in the corner of the room until I found the small wooden case. When I opened it, the whistle inside looked dull, the metal cold under my fingers. I sat by the fire, tried a note, and was surprised that it came out at all. Over the next few days, I began to practice. I played in the mornings before the market, and in the evenings after the animals were fed. At first, my notes were thin and weak, but slowly they grew fuller. I found myself remembering old tunes without trying, and I began to hum them as I worked. Music was returning to my days in a way it had not been for years. It felt like a gift I had been given without asking, one I could carry anywhere. One morning, a week after hearing the whistle from Mr. Clancy's shop, I walked through the square early. The air was cold, and the market stalls were still empty. As I passed the music shop, the door opened. Mr. Clancy stepped out, holding a broom. His eyes caught mine for a moment. I expected him to look away, but he didn't. Instead, he watched me as I walked past. I felt my steps slow, but I kept going. The sound of the broom brushing the stone followed me down the street. 2 days later, I was in the garden when my aunt called to me from the gate. She held a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She said it had been left at the market stall by someone who did not give their name. Inside was a piece of sheet music, handwritten in neat lines. It was an old tune, one I recognized from the summer gatherings of my childhood. There was no message, but the careful way it had been copied told me it had not been done in haste. I placed the music on the table and looked at it for a long time. I thought of the whistle, of my father, of the violin that had stopped me in the street. I thought of Mr. Clancy's face in the cold morning light, and of the sound of my clapping in the village hall. I could not be certain the music had come from him, but I felt sure enough. That night I practiced the tune until it was steady, each note falling into place like a small stone in a wall. The next week passed without seeing him again. The market grew busier as the weather softened, and the square filled with voices and color. I played the whistle often now, sometimes by the open window so the sound drifted into the street. I did not know if he ever heard it, but part of me hoped he did. It felt different to give the music away than to keep it to myself. One afternoon, I was on my way back from the harbor when I saw the blue door open again. Mr. Clancy stood in it, holding a violin. His hand moved over the strings as if checking the tune, but he was not playing. His eyes met mine across the square. I waited for him to turn away, but he lifted the violin and began to play. The tune was the same one from the sheet music, the same one I had been practicing each night. His version was smooth, without hesitation, and it filled the air with a warmth that reached me even from a distance. I stood and listened until he stopped. Then he lowered the violin, and without a word, he stepped back into the shop and closed the door. I walked home slowly, the sound of the music still clear in my mind. I did not need an apology, and I did not think he expected one from me. The music had spoken in its own way, and it had said enough. That evening, I played the same tune on my whistle by the open window. The sky outside was red with sunset, and the sound drifted into the street. Somewhere, perhaps in the quiet of his shop, I hoped he was listening. The days grew longer, and the air lost its winter sharpness. The sea still roared on windy nights, but the sun had begun to warm the stones of the streets during the day. I spent more time outside, carrying baskets for my aunt, visiting the harbor, and sometimes sitting by the cliff path to play my whistle where no one could hear me but the gulls. Yet every time I passed the music shop, I slowed just a little, wondering if the blue door might open again. Sometimes it did, but only for a moment. I would see Mr. Clancy step outside to sweep the path or bring in a box from the cart. He never spoke to me, but he also never looked away in the sharp, cold way he had done before. His eyes would meet mine briefly, and then he would return to his work. It was not friendship, but it was no longer the same distance as before. I began to think that silence could sometimes be a kind of peace. One morning, my aunt asked me to take a basket of eggs to the school on the other side of the square. It was early, and the market stalls were still being set up. As I passed the shop, I heard a sound that made me stop in my tracks. It was the violin again, but this time the tune was slow and full, like the sea moving under the moon. I stood just far enough away to hear without being in his doorway. The music wrapped around the square, filling the empty space before the day began. When it stopped, I walked on, carrying the basket carefully. At the school, the children were laughing in the yard, their voices rising above the low wall. I gave the eggs to the teacher and turned back toward the market. The smell of baking bread and fresh fish reached me before I saw the stalls. The square was coming alive, but I could still hear the memory of the music in my mind. That afternoon, I decided to take a different way home. It led past the back of the music shop, where a small alley opened onto the lane. The door there was ajar, and I could see the warm light from inside. On the workbench near the door lay pieces of wood, shavings curling like thin ribbons. I could hear the faint sound of strings being tested, not a full tune, but small notes, careful and exact. I stepped past quickly, not wanting him to see me there. That evening, I played my whistle by the open window. The tune was the one he had played that morning in the square. The notes were not as smooth as his, but they carried the shape of the melody. The air outside was cool, and the sky was painted in colors that only lasted a few minutes before fading to gray. As I played, I imagined the sound drifting through the streets, finding its way to the blue door. The next day, something unusual happened. When I walked through the square, I saw a small piece of paper pinned to the notice board near the market. It was written in a neat, strong hand, and it said there would be a gathering of musicians on the first Saturday of the month in the village hall. All were welcome to play or listen. My heart gave a small jump when I saw that the paper was signed simply C. I could not be sure, but I thought I knew who had put it there. The first Saturday of the month came quickly. By the time I arrived at the hall, the fire was glowing and chairs had been set out in a circle. People were tuning instruments, and the air was full of the mixed sounds of strings, whistles, and voices greeting each other. I sat near the edge of the circle, my whistle in my lap. I did not know if I would be brave enough to play, but I wanted to hear the others. Mr. Clancy was there, standing near the fire with his violin. He was speaking to an older man I did not know. His voice was calm, and there was no sign of the sharp anger I had seen on the morning we first met. When the music began, it was like a tide moving through the room. One tune flowed into another, each player taking turns to lead. The sound filled every space, and the warmth from the fire and the music together made me forget the cold outside. After a while, the older man beside Mr. Clancy began a tune I knew well. My fingers moved on the whistle without thinking. I joined in softly at first, then louder when I felt the notes settle under my hands. No one turned to stare. No one stopped me. Instead, the music welcomed me, carrying my notes along with the others. When the tune ended, there was a ripple of soft smiles around the circle, and the next tune began without pause. The evening went on like that, tune after tune, the sound rising and falling like waves. I forgot to be nervous. I forgot to wonder if I belonged there. I simply played. When the music finally slowed and people began to put their instruments away, I felt as if I had stepped out of another world. The hall seemed quieter, but the warmth stayed with me. As I left, I saw Mr. Clancy standing by the door. He did not speak, but as I passed, he gave a small nod. It was not an apology and not an invitation, but something in between. I returned the nod and stepped out into the night, the cool air against my face. The stars were bright above the dark roofs, and the sound of the music still played in my mind. In the weeks that followed, the gatherings continued. Sometimes I played, sometimes I only listened. Each time, the space between Mr. Clancy and me seemed a little smaller. We still did not speak much, but I began to understand that not all respect needs to be spoken aloud. It can grow quietly, like a seed in the dark. One late spring evening, I was walking home from the market when I heard a familiar tune drifting through the air. It was the same one he had played the day after the sheet music arrived at my aunt's house. I stopped in the middle of the square and listened. When the tune ended, I lifted my whistle and played the same notes back into the air. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the shop, the violin began again, this time with a different melody, and I answered with mine. We played like that for several minutes, trading tunes across the space between us. It was a conversation made only of music, yet it said everything that needed to be said. When the last notes faded, I lowered my whistle. The blue door of the shop stayed closed, but I stood there for a moment, smiling to myself. I knew I had not stolen anything that day or on the day we first met. I had simply listened, and in the end, I had given something back. The payment had not been coins or clapping this time, but a tune shared in the open air where anyone could hear it. As I walked home, the sun was setting over the sea, and the light turned the water gold. The wind was soft against my face, carrying the faintest echo of music. I thought of how the elder had said that some gifts in life are given freely. Now I understood that music was one of them. You could not hold it in your hand or lock it away behind a door. It lived in the space between people, in the moments when someone played and someone else listened. And when it was shared, it belonged to both.